Mist clings to the stones like a second skin, softening edges, swallowing footprints, turning every torch into a small sun. A diver's light stutters in the green-brown water below, cutting a thin, uncertain path through silt that has settled for centuries. A bell-like tone rings somewhere deep in the chamber, a sound that feels older than language itself. No one knows who first named this place the Recluse Scribe's Codex. It is a name carried in fragments, a half-remembered entry in a 19th-century explorer's journal, a fisher's tale murmured at dusk, and an inscription so faint it reads like a memory on crumbling plaster, recorded 1930s. The enigma deepens with every measured breath you take inside these vaults. If you stood here among the mist and stone, would you trust your eyes or the instruments the labs hand you? The question hangs like condensation. It does not demand an answer so much as it insists you live with the uncertainty. A single candle flame reveals grooves in the carved shelf where someone once rested a reed pen. 3 sets of fingerprints, partial and overlapped, sit preserved in a hard resin that time made like glass. The room smells faintly of iron and old paper, or what we imagine old paper might smell like after being underwater for an age. Scholars who have published brief notes on the site call it ambiguous, an inland chapel turned library, a watertight vault, or an isolated workshop, survey notes, recent photogrammetry. None of these labels fit entirely. The Codex resists classification like a closed palm. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not the object itself but the deliberate obscurity around it, doors sealed from the outside, records erased, maps drawn with hands that avoided cartographers. It begins with a reed-stained key, found at low tide by a boy searching for crab pots. He hammered it open with a rock and the sea exhaled into the world something it had been keeping, pages sealed within a bronze canister, wrapped in linen, each page written in a script that pauses like breathe between words. The first modern report, Museum Registry, 1978, notes the canister's alloy as unusual, a copper blend with an unexpectedly high tin content and a trace of meteoritic iron. No one knows how the canister held dry for centuries while submerged. No one knows why the handwriting switches from a confident, looping hand into a cramped, hurried scrawl halfway through the 5th leaf. No one knows if the cramped scrawl is the last hand of a scribe, or the first tremor of someone who had seen the sea open like a wound. The scribe, whenever he, or she, lived, writes like a mapmaker tying knots. Line after line curves into sigils that repeat, a series of anchored circles and small crosses that look like the bones of an alphabet, and the bones of a ritual layered together. There are diagrams too, a small constellation, a plan of a room with angled walls, a drawing of a device that is half clockwork, half incense burner. As a narrator, I offer you what we can measure, and what we must only imagine. Thermoluminescence attempts to date the canister's outer crust. Radiocarbon returns wide ranges because marine contamination is a treacherous translator. Laser scanning reveals tool marks that a modern jeweler would recognize, yet the metalworking methods suggested do not appear in any known corpus until a century later. Laserscan Survey, 2018. The credibility anchors leave us uneasy. There is proof and there are gaps. Between them lies the story. The boy who found the key kept it hidden for months, afraid of what the grown-ups might do. Local voices say he placed the canister under his pillow and dreamed in a language of tides and paper. The village elder, when pressed decades later, mutters a word in the old tongue, fizz, guardian, and then shakes his head as if to dislodge it. What would you do holding such a thing against your chest? Would you hand it over to the nearest archive, or would you teach yourself to read its breaths first? There is a photograph taken in poor light, grainy and slightly out of focus, that shows the canister open on a wooden table. Hands, many of them, reach toward the pages, some gloved, some not. A white-gloved hand belongs to a museum curator who later refused further comment. Photograph, private collection. The assemblage of hands mirrors the manuscript's own overlapping scripts, the past multiplied by those who would possess it. The text resists taxonomy because it is written across registers, liturgical notation, inventor's shorthand, and something like an index of remedies. One page lists plant names with annotations in the margins that read like procedural warnings. Do not bind the left leaf on nights when the moon is thin. The voice of the scribe sometimes sounds like a practical clerk, Other times, the sentences rise into metaphor as if the book is teaching itself to dream. No one knows whether the Codex was meant to preserve knowledge or to hide it. A fragment in the middle contains an interrupted table, measurements for lenses, temperatures, a sketch of a vessel with a spout that seems designed to channel sound. Who would craft a device to move voice like water? The Codex's diagrams suggest a culture of hybrid craft, artisans who could tune bronze as if it were a string and who understood the behavior of light through layered glass. Sketch sheet, folio 12. There are notations that look like recipes and equations side by side, as if a potter and an astronomer spoke to the same page and left in a hurry. Modern laboratories cannot agree on one thing: was the Codex a manual, a liturgy, or a coded ledger? Some suggest it is a ledger of voyages and debts, economic interpretations. Others propose it is a ritual handbook designed to call and hold a place, ritualist view. Mainstream consensus dissolves into multiple plausible atmospheres. The motifs repeat, circles within circles, key notations, a small emblem that scholars now call the Recluse mark. Where the mark appears, marginalia swirl. Where it does not, the handwriting is spare. What does a mark ask of a reader? To stop, to perform, to be recorded? Or to forget? A laboratory in the capital ran pigment tests on the inks and found iron gall where none should be, recipes that imply the use of seaweed, ash, and an acid bath made from vinegar and saline. Chemical analysis, 2016. The shoreward materials twist the Codex's provenance toward a maritime economy, but the handwriting shows a literacy tradition more commonly associated with inland monastic libraries. This contradiction makes the narrative feel like a riddle written in two hands. Imagine the scribe alone in a small, angled room with a single window that faces the sea. A pulley swings, a basket transports air and light and small things. There is the constant, patient rhythm of tides and the slow erosion of stone. When the scribe writes, the pen moves as if it knows the tide's secret. Strokes begin thick, thin, then gather themselves into careful knots. One phrase returns so often it becomes a refrain. Remember the turning. It is unclear whether it is an instruction about gears, a warning about seasons, or a religious admonition. The ambiguity is the Codex's siren song. No one knows if the turning is mechanical or cosmic. No one knows whether the scribe believed in the literal motion of gears or the cyclic motion of rites. A conservator opens the canister for the first time under lamplight. The linen whispers with dust as if an animal breathed away. Pages, blackened at the edges, exhaled the smell of salt and something like citrus, as if lemon oil, used by a hand long ago to preserve leather, survived both water and time. The Codex bears corrections in several hands. A later hand, with a steadier, more practiced touch, crosses out an entire stanza and annotates it with a single word. Wrong. Does wrong mean technically incorrect, ethically dangerous, or politically suspect? The margin gives no help. There are signs the Codex traveled. Tiny abrasion marks on the upper corners suggest it was once bound and then unbound, perhaps to remove a portion, perhaps to hide a page. Small accretions of mineral deposit in one fold indicate exposure to brackish tide. Conservation Notes, 2019. Each physical detail is a breadcrumb. Each breadcrumb leads to questions. The village that claims the find has a ruined tower on its edge, half swallowed by marsh. Elders tell of a recluse who lived in the tower, a person who took in manuscripts, repaired clocks, and refused to attend festivals. Oral history, local archive. They say the recluse welcomed only one visitor a year and left gifts of small, precise mechanisms on the town steps. The image of a recluse fits the Codex, a solitary craftsperson working between tides and ink. But the Codex's contents betray communal knowledge, lists of names, ledger entries, protocol for rites that require multiple attendants. How could a single sequestered scribe record the labor of a whole guild? Perhaps the scribe was the keeper of knowledge, not the sole knower. A community archives tasks to one body to preserve continuity when hands age or die. Yet the secrecy implied by the tower and the sea suggests that what we call stewardship may have been cloaked with fear. Fear of what? That knowledge can unsettle trade, unsettle power, or unsettle belief? A note in the Codex, underlined twice, reads, "Do not speak the name when the moon is a thin coin." A practical instruction, or superstition? The line between the two is porous. Researchers who studied the metallography of the canister point to complex casting techniques inconsistent with the region's apparent technological timeline. Metallography Report, 2021. One possible explanation is contact, trade routes that brought not just goods but methods. Another is independent invention, a brilliant aberration that occurred when a small community required an unusual solution. Small communities often innovate to address local problems. But innovation leaves traces and trade leaves signatures. The archaeology map has few of either near the tower. Around the Codex's pages are sketches that read like architectural notes: a chamber with angled walls, a grate beneath the floor, a shaft that funnels wind. When archaeologists probed the ruined tower's foundation, a hollowing was detected. When divers explored near a shoal, they found a sunken pilaster with matching tool marks. Survey, 2017. The pieces begin to whisper of an associated site now beneath the waves. If the chamber exists underwater, who sealed it, and why? Was it an act of preservation, a ritual concealment, or a terrified attempt to bury something shameful? Theories proliferate because the evidence is a fertile field where imagination can plant. Some suggest the Codex holds navigational secrets, charts of currents that would grant a fleet advantage, navigation hypothesis. Others argue for a religious function, rites that bind a community to its place and its dead, ritual hypothesis. Still others feel the air of the uncanny, notes that imply an interest in sound as architecture, in voices shaped by devices that funnel and temper. Sound as architecture, a device sketched in Folio 18 resembles a horn turned inside out, with chambers designed to resonate at night. Who would need such a thing? A ritualist seeking to call the past? An engineer working to transmit warnings across water? A maker of musical instruments for ceremonies lost to time? Again, the Codex offers possibilities rather than conclusions, and possibility becomes the engine of fascination. There is another voice in the paper, the voice of those who came later. Officials from the capital arrived with boxes, forms, and calm faces. They catalogued, photographed, and left with promises. They returned months later with a paper that condensed the find into a bureaucratic sentence. Archive Memo, 1981. There is an old photograph of a census clerk, his sleeves rolled, poring over the pages as if trying to find his mother's name. But bureaucracy cannot explain away the strange details. Annotations in an unknown ink near the back of the Codex use an abbreviated cipher that repeats the Recluse mark and contains lists of numbers that do not map to currency or grain. When a codebreaker tried to isolate patterns, the results only suggested a method rather than a message. Alternating runs, short bursts, a long break. It reads like breath. No one knows the purpose of that cipher. No one knows whether those numbers are dates, coordinates, or ritual counts. There is a moral current under the curiosity, the question of stewardship. Who has the right to possess the Codex? The boy who found it and dreamed? The village that remembers the recluse? The state that catalogs and stores? The scholars who want to test it? Every choice about custody becomes also a decision about meaning. Conservationists argue for slow exposure and careful analysis. Nationalists speak of repatriation and cultural patrimony. Dealers in the shadow economy imagine auctions. Each voice draws a different map on which the Codex must be placed. When the Codex was finally displayed, briefly, in a museum with thick glass and climate control, people traveled from far away to see the pages. They stood, hands clasped, faces lit with smartphone glow, and read what they could until a guard politely suggested they step back. Some visitors pressed their foreheads to the glass as if to pass into the parchment a fever, an answer. A small online forum, enthusiasts of maritime oddities, catalogued every visible symbol, every bloom of ink. Their amateur transcriptions filled dozens of threads. Some notes were plausible, some fanciful. The collective attention turned the Codex into a public dream. And dreams are dangerous when they harden into claims. A fringe blog suggested the Codex contained instructions to call a tide of stone. A historian refuted the grammar in 3 paragraphs and a correction that ended with the gentle phrase, "No evidence supports this." The push and pull of community interpretation mirrors the scribed margins. Everyone wants to read the blank spaces. Through the scratches and the stains, a human story waits, a scribe bent at a desk, a community keeping secrets, a sea that remembers everything we attempt to hide. We can trace the human acts, the folding of linen, the sealing of a canister, the choice to submerge, yet the why remains stubbornly private. At night the tower's ruin stands as a silhouette against the sky, its outline chewed by weather. A gull nests in the corner where a window once existed. Its shadow traverses the same arc that a lantern might have traced. If you listen, the wind seems to be cataloging, a registry of small histories rattling through broken mortar. How do we balance reverence and inquiry? Do we treat the Codex as a sacred object to be preserved at all costs, or as a text that needs to be read, analyzed, and perhaps even performed? Those who study material culture insist on a middle path: preserve integrity while permitting controlled testing, conservation protocol. In practice, the path is narrow and treacherous. Testing can mean loss, preservation can mean ossification. Both courses carry ethical weight. One folio contains a prayer-like sequence followed by a list of names, not saints, but members of a guild, perhaps, annotated with small symbols. Next to one name, a tiny cross. Next to another, a small star. The annotations look like votes, marks of presence, or declarations of office. If the Codex registers a community structure, then it is both ledger and heart. No one knows whether the community persisted after the pages were sealed. No one knows if any living descendant still keeps the old lullabies or the precise way of tying a sail. Time has a way of erasing continuity where it is most needed. As the sun dips, the canister's metal catches light like a promise. A conservator runs a gloved finger across a rim and says the word preservation like a benediction. Outside, gulls wheel and a washing line flaps like a signal. At what point does curiosity become theft? At what point does protection become imprisonment? You are not asked to decide now. Instead, you are asked to watch and listen, to let the traces accumulate in your mind and to carry them like a pebble in your pocket. The narrative is not a puzzle with a single correct fitting, it is a space to inhabit. Intermittently, the Codex offers startling specifics that merge the mundane with the uncanny. A notation details a mechanism for drawing breath from a sealed room, a contraption of layered valves and bellows that suggests the scribe worried about air as much as ink. Is it a formula for survival, an engineering aside, or a metaphor for memory? When engineers constructed a replica based on the sketch, small differences in measurements produced wildly different acoustic results. Experimental reconstruction, 2020. At certain frequencies the device hummed, at others it amplified silence. To hear silence enlarged is a strange and unsettling thing. No one knows whether the original makers intended that effect. No one knows whether amplified silence was used to listen to the dead, to hold their community, or to protect a secret. There are moments in the pages that read like confessions, a single sentence, abruptly inserted, that names an event only obliquely. On the thin night we sealed the doors, followed by a list of tools used and one name with no annotation. The absolute sparsity shocks more than any flourish. The scribe could have elaborated and did not. The omission is its own loudness. Who sealed the doors and why is it not that pulls at the rest of the story? A plausible scenario, a sudden epidemic, a political purge, a ritual schedule aligning with cosmic events. Each fits the scant facts differently, none fits wholly. As the modern world presses in, with its microscopes, its cameras, its hungry markets, the Codex sits between past and present like a held breath. Museums put it behind safety glass. Scholars publish careful caveats. The public makes memes and theories. The object becomes a mirror reflecting what we most want to see. No one knows if the Codex will ever surrender a single definitive truth. Perhaps it was never meant to. Perhaps its purpose was to bind knowledge into forms that require maintenance, guardianship, or deliberate misuse to be unlocked. And so we read, and we measure, and we dream. The story of the Recluse Scribe's Codex is less a linear tale than a palimpsest, layers of intention, acts of concealment, technical skill, devotional care, and human fear pressed into one another. If you listen closely, you can hear the scribe's hand on paper, a soft, ancient friction like tide over pebble. No one knows where the next page of this story will be found, what small act will unfasten a new set of crumbs. But the Codex continues to teach us the rhythms of containment, how communities bind themselves, how knowledge is kept, and how, inevitably, secrets become stories. The divers speak in light, their beams carving thin tunnels through the green. Hands close around cold iron, breath fogs and brief, controlled pulses. A door waits beneath silt like a face half buried in sand. They came with machines and patience, a remote-operated vehicle whose camera blinked like an insect eye, a team of breath-hold divers trained in the slow art of delicate touch, and a small boat with a radio that spat weather reports into the dark. The survey began as method and turned into ritual as the crew learned the sea's rhythm. Each low tide was an audience, each high tide a curtain. Photogrammetry mapped surfaces and layered clouds. Photogrammetry Survey, 2018, revealing tool marks that matched sketches in the Codex and a seam along bedrock that suggested a deliberate closure. A single diver pressed a gloved palm to the lid and felt a scarred groove where a lever had once turned. He traced the mark, found that it fit the recoil of the bronze canister's clasp, and for a heartbeat imagined that metal and stone were parts of the same machine. When the door opened, the water did not roar in. Instead it breathed like a lung, moving in slow, pneumatic waves that seemed almost intentional. Behind the threshold, a passage sloped down and curled like the inside of a shell. Barnacles refracted light into small, impossible stars. The interior smelled of old salt and the faint scent of resin. It smelled like a closed thing remembering the air. Inside the chamber, portions of masonry held fast to the geometry described in one of the Codex's diagrams. Angled walls, niches carved to hold small instruments, a central pit whose mouth matched a sketch of a spiral bell. The correlation tightened the narrative. The Codex had been an instruction set for a built space, and that space had been hidden with care. If you stood in that chamber, what would you do first? Measure, pray, or listen? They chose to listen. Sensors, designed for subtle vibrations, were set like small sentries around the spiral bell. Engineers tuned microphones to a range beneath human hearing, to frequencies that wake membranes and slide between bones. At first, the recordings captured nothing more than the slow settling of stone and the distant, organ-like groan of tide through cavities. Then, when some diver brushed a rusted plate with a gloved fingertip, the air hummed and a tone uncoiled, a single, pure note that lingered longer than physics seemed to allow. The engineers called it resonance, the local folk called it the bell that remembers. In laboratory notes the tone's harmonics were unusual, a cluster of partials that suggested a cavity modulated by layered membranes and a metallic element tuned with uncommon precision. Acoustic Analysis, 2020. To hear that note in the chamber is to be reminded that sound is an architecture we rarely think to inhabit. The device sketched in Folio 18, when reconstructed and tested on a workbench, produced similar tones when air moved through chambers at specific pressures. An engineer described it as an acoustic amplifier, a device that shaped silence and sound into intentional form. But to call it merely an amplifier is to miss the social logic of its making. The device's notches and tabs suggested standardization, the work of a guild accustomed to replicable instrument making. Guilds require records, records require custodians. And in the Codex the custodian is not a single person so much as a role, the scribe of turning, the line where counting and prayer meet. The roll's annotations read like minutes from a ritual meeting, names, duties, and the order in which breathers would stand and release air into the spiral bell. The list implies a ceremony, choreographed and precise, a performance of containment. Containment takes many forms. Here, it was both literal and metaphorical, a device to control sound, an instruction set to bind a process, and a social protocol to ensure its correct execution. When researchers simulated the ritual, breathers standing at marked spindles and releasing air at counted intervals, the chamber's resonance shifted, producing standing waves that concentrated at specific points and made loose dust lift in measured motion. It was not merely sound, it was a choreography of air and stone. Why choreograph breath? The Codex offers hints and refuses direct testimony. One folio pairs the device's diagram with a passage that reads like an aside. To keep the word whole. Is this about preserving language against mishearing, ensuring chants are held exactly as intended? Or is it a more practical technology, a method to transmit signals across water, to warn, to summon, to coordinate? The margins keep their silence. When the team brought a historian to the chamber, she paused at a carved lintel where the Recluse marks sat in relief. She murmured a name from her studies, a coastal confraternity recorded in tax ledgers a century later, and suggested that the device may have functioned as a legalizing instrument, a way to pronounce agreements in a manner that admitted no doubt, since the tones themselves were auditable and replicable. Historical ledger references, 1862 to 1871. Contracts, she argued, might have been sealed not with ink but with orchestrated sound. Friends of theory debated. Could a community build mechanisms to make agreements that were witnessable across tides? Could an acoustic signature stand as a signature of a person or a pact? There is poetry to the idea and a technical plausibility that makes it tempting. The Codex complicates the matter with recipes for pigments, and an appended list of plants whose names are annotated with small crosses. A modern ethnobotanist recognized several entries as local seaweeds used in tanning and dyeing. Others were unfamiliar, perhaps extinct or misnamed. The presence of medicinal notes alongside mechanical drawings implies a culture that fused craft, care, and liturgy into single pages. Ethnobotanical Notes, 2019. How do you legislate a community in which the same hand repairs a bell and tends a dying neighbor? The local elder told a story of a night when the sea refused to give up a child. Children had been playing on a low spit of sand, and a sudden swell took one of them. The community acted with the device's protocol. They positioned breathers at marked points, saying, and the sound that rose seemed to steer the currents slowly, allowing the child to be recovered. Whether this story is literal or a symbolic memory becomes less important than its function. It explains why a technology linked to sound would be carefully guarded and ritualized. The team discovered another layer in the Codex's margins, numbers arranged in columns that, when punched into a simple frequency analysis, correlated to tidal tables used in a different century. If someone in the past had encoded hydrological knowledge as rhythmic counts, it would be both cunning and practical, a method to transmit timing without exposing maps. Secret knowledge travels well when disguised as art. With this possibility came darker questions. If sound could be used to manipulate water, could it also be used to control minds? To create suggestive atmospheres? To induce sleep? The Codex contains ritual phrases that, when read aloud beneath the spiral bell in the reconstructed setup, produced a light-headed calm in some listeners. Experimental Report, 2021. Ethics committees raised their hands. Experiments must proceed with caution. The past technologies become modern responsibilities. Responsibility also applies to access. The team had to negotiate the involvement of the village and the state, to balance local claims with scientific inquiry. Elders insisted that certain chants not be recorded, that the ritual only be performed in private. The researchers agreed to limits, and the chamber remained partly sealed against full exposure. Permission became a ritual of its own, negotiated in small acts of trust that mirrored the community's original protocols. Permission, however, does not prevent theft. One night, a cache of small instruments went missing from a locked crate on the shore. Tools that matched the Codex's descriptions vanished, leaving only a smear of oil and a misaligned padlock. Suspicion fell across many shoulders: a visiting scholar with debts, a local youth enticed by promises, a dealer with an appetite for antiquities. The theft itself raised the possibility that some agents viewed the Codex less as heritage and more as commodity. The missing tools reappeared weeks later under an old wet towel in a boat shed, their edges dulled by use. Someone had tested them. Someone had sought to replicate a sound and either failed or fled with knowledge incomplete. The return of the tools did not erase the theft's consequences. Trust, once broken, is a brittle thing. Patterns persisted in the Codex that suggested a calendrical logic, markings beside names that followed lunar phases, annotations about when to oil mechanisms, when to unstop vents. The community that produced such records would have synchronized their lives to the device, not only for ceremony, but for survival. And if survival relied on ritual, the line between technology and religion blurs until it becomes impossible to parse. Archaeologists mapped a small harbor near the tower and found laid stones forming a channel whose orientation matched a star pattern drawn faintly in the Codex. When astronomers plotted the pattern, they found that at certain precession-corrected dates the alignment corresponded to a rising of a star now dimmed by centuries of dust. Astronomical correlation. Modeling 2020. If the chamber's openings aligned with celestial events, then the builders were attuned to cycles on the scale of ages, a long view not often associated with coastal fishermen. The possibility that the Codex encoded a ritual calendar that synchronized tides with stars made the device more than local technology. It became a mechanism for orchestrating time itself, a way to coordinate labor, prayer, and defense across seasons and generations. And yet, the Codex contains human grief. A folio toward the back repeats a name like a chant and then adds a note. Taken when moon was thin. The brevity of the register suggests a record of loss, not a technical datum. Loss sits on the Codex like salt incrustation, it adheres and alters. In late autumn, a diver reported hearing a lullaby in the chamber, a child's voice that was not there, or perhaps a memory made audible by the stone. He described a melody unlike any local song, a lilting pattern that rose and fell like tide and referenced words that matched a marginal note in the Codex. When the recording was analyzed, faint harmonic structures that resembled human song envelopes were present below the audible threshold. Whether they were artifacts of the device or of the human mind imposing pattern on noise remained unresolved. The team considered invoking the device as a historical performance, a careful, consented enactment designed to understand function. Some warned that performance risks transforming an object into theater. Others argued that embodied practice reveals tacit knowledge that papers do not capture. The debate is old as scholarship. What do we gain by doing versus only observing? A summer of careful enactments produced surprising results. When the ritual was rehearsed with community elders present, the chamber's resonance shifted in subtle ways compared to when scientists alone performed the sequence. The presence of those who carried oral memory, the lullabies, the gestures, the timing, altered the acoustic outcome. Tacit knowledge mattered. The device's function depended on human practice as much as geometry. If knowledge is performative, then silence can be an act of preservation. The community's insistence on secrecy may have been a way of keeping the technology functioning by preventing its commodification. When tools diffuse without the accompanying practices that give them meaning, they can become dangerous. This theory was tested when a small team attempted to replicate the ritual in a different chamber, using the same diagrams but without the presence of tradition bearers. The experiment produced tones but not the resonant clarity achieved in the original site. The effect felt hollow, like an echo without an origin. Replication without context yields simulacra, and simulacra can mislead. One night a map was found tucked into the Codex's binding, a folded scrap barely visible unless the light struck it at a certain angle. Ink had faded to the color of rust. The map showed a coastline with a marked inlet. Beside the inlet, a single symbol, the Recluse mark circled twice. The fold was old, fingerprints darkened the crease. The existence of a map suggests movement beyond the tower and the chamber. Perhaps the Codex belonged to a network of sites, each a node in a circuit of knowledge guarded by a dispersed community. If so, then the story grows larger, not an isolated eccentricity but a system that threaded coasts and islands with practices that kept knowledge alive across distance. As the team prepared to follow the map, bureaucratic obstacles and weather delays conspired, and months slipped. When they returned to the harbor, an old fisherman met them with a quiet note. "You will only find what you are meant to find." His eyes glistened with unshed rain or remembered tides. His hands moved as if turning pages. Whether he meant the map or the knowledge itself, he did not say. The narrative thickened with each small discovery. A list of names that matched those recorded in a distant ledger. A fragment of cloth whose weave resembled a pattern known to a neighboring island. A carved tool whose handle carried the same notch as the canister clasp. These convergences formed a lattice that suggested not accident but intention. And yet, secrets tighten. Someone in the village placed a small sealed packet at the museum's doorstep with no note and no return address. Inside, a single, water-dulled shell and a scrap of parchment with a single line of cramped script. "Do not let the bell ring on the thin night." The handwriting was not the scribe's, yet the warning resonated like an echo. Who delivered the packet? Why now? The question tasted of urgency. History moves forward in small, sometimes cryptic acts. The past speaks in fragments and in gestures meant to adjust the present. When the team prepared to follow the map, they found the inlet silted, its mouth reshaped by a storm 2 years earlier. What sea conceals, storms can reveal or erase. They dredged carefully and found the top of a mast, the curve of a column, and stones dressed in tools that matched the tower's masonry. The sea returned its own archives in slow, grudging pieces. At the bottom of one trench they found a plaque hammered into rock, 2 concentric circles with a small notch at the south, an alignment marker. The notch's angle matched a sketch in the Codex. Holding the plaque, one of the team whispered, as if to the stone, "We are not the first to stand here." As they mapped, the alignment suggested a ritual time to a star now visible only in the records. If the plaque once oriented ceremonies, then its removal or burial might have been an act of protest or protection. When did a community decide to hide its own coordinate system? What event made exposure more dangerous than secrecy? Answers remain partial. Each discovery posed 2 new questions. The Codex, like an index kept at the edge of readability, continued to teach by withholding. In the chamber, amidst the instruments and the pages, a new sound emerged. A low scrape as if a heavy lid were nudged. The team froze. From the passageway a figure appeared, damp and shaking, eyes wide with a story that had not yet found language. He carried in his hand a small wooden tablet with the same concentric mark burned onto it. He spoke one sentence, and it landed like a stone in the team's water. "They come when the bell is called. They come when the bell is called," he repeats, and the words hang in the damp air like a rope waiting to be pulled. His fingers curl around the little wooden tablet. The burned concentric mark is raw with old smoke. He looks like someone who has slept with the sea at his chest. The team's translator leans forward, the beam of her headlamp making a small sun on the tablet's surface. She pronounces the word in the old tongue and then in the modern one. Both sound too short for what they mean. The figure, salt-stiff, eyes hollow with too much seeing, says that the callers are not a single kind of thing. They are human and not, he claims, fishermen turned keepers, keepers turned traffickers of ritual, and then, in whispered syllables, a third category he cannot label in any language he knows. His voice breaks on the last admission, as if naming had a cost. Outside, the sea presses at history like a hand on a page. It seems to want the story to be finished, and yet protects the loose threads that make the tale interesting. Who are the callers, then? Guardians, thieves, something older? The man, call him Tomas, though he offers no full name, was not the first to warn them of visitors who came on nights when the bell was rung for reasons official and reasons secret. Oral testimony, local archive. He tells of boats that would slip in at low tide, hulls black as gull shadow, carrying men who traded in pieces of ritual for modern things. Wire, batteries, chemicals that smell like industry. He says the callers learned to mimic the old protocols poorly, clipping rights into transactions, and in that poor mimicry, something dangerous was made. The notion of mimicry unsettles the researchers more than outright theft. A ritual performed without the context that birthed it becomes performance, and performance can be sold. If the acoustic device's function depends on embodiment, then copying the geometry without the practice is like copying a prayer without the belief. The result can be hollow, yet harmful. Ethnographers in the team murmur about cultural appropriation in its most literal and perilous form. Field Notes, 2021. Tomas's fingers find a notch on the tablet, and trace it as if picking a wound. He says simply, that one summer the callers came with a man who called himself an engineer and spoke in numbers. He offered maps and promises and a compact device that whirred when you held it near the spiral bell. They wanted to replicate the tone cheaply, to bottle the sound and sell it by the harbor. The community refused. They hid tools. They sealed the chamber again. Afterwards, some of the callers did not leave. There is an undertow to the story, a moral current, that proves hard to ignore. When technology circulates without custodianship, it can become an instrument of control rather than care. Tomas's accusation is blunt. The callers wanted not the knowledge for its own sake, but for leverage, for votes, for debt, for fear. The team records his words, but the recorder's microphone picks up more than his confession. It picks up the scrape of a gull's wing and the distant sound of a buoy bell, and in that overlap meaning becomes slippery. If power can be encoded into sound, what responsibilities attach to those who hold it? The question presses against modern ethics like a tide against a cliff, persistent, eroding, and patient. The research group debates next steps in whispers that would be audible across the water if one listened. Some argue for a hard firewall, secure the Codex in an institution and ration access. Others push for democratization, publish the diagrams, subject them to peer review, let the world judge. The village elders, when consulted, offer either model. They say only that some things were meant to be buried until the community chose otherwise. Village Council Minutes, 2022. Negotiation becomes a ritual of its own, with the same fragile trust that governed the original practices. One of the younger researchers, obsessed with pattern rather than precedent, tries to model the callers as a network. He draws lines between the harbor and ports, between traders and institutions, mapping how knowledge might flow in shadow and in daylight. The graph makes the problem look countable and neat. It also makes clear the vulnerability. Once encoded, knowledge leaks through the smallest seams, a shared joke, a revealed recipe, a drunken brag. Containment requires more than locks. It requires culturally coherent stewardship. Late that night, Tomas crawls close to the map plaque and, in a voice small as if not to wake the tide, says that the callers aren't only men who traffic tools. There is a machine now, he says. It rings like the bell, but it is not the bell. It calls by electricity. It calls by law. His image, of a bell recast as policy, a ritual recast as ordinance, unsettles the legal scholars who nod politely and take notes. They have not yet wrestled with the idea that a sound can be legislated. As the team lays out options, a local news crew arrives with bright lights and sharper questions. The presence of cameras complicates everything. Media attention invites investors and opportunists. It also protects the site by putting it under public scrutiny. The paradox is ancient. Publicity both shields and exposes. When a clip of Tomas's story circulates online, callers from distant ports send messages. Offers arrive in multiple tongues: money, technology, anonymity. With each offer, the question of custody grows thornier. A leak, petty and human, becomes the pivot. Someone posts a blurred photo of the reconstructed spiral bell to an online forum for sea myth enthusiasts. The image lacks scale, but the shape is visible and the commenters begin to conjecture. Within 48 hours, a buyer in a different country messages a researcher with language that is careful and then dangerously interested. He promises funds for conservation if he can observe the ritual being performed. The offer reads like an ultimatum wrapped in philanthropy. How do you refuse when the ledger looks attractive? How do you maintain integrity when research needs money? These are not merely bureaucratic questions. They become moral trials that reveal how easily historical curiosity can be co-opted by modern appetites. One night, a ruptured crate reveals stolen notes. The thief, it appears, was clumsy: a torn satchel, a dropped journal, a cigarette ember that burned faintly in the wet. The investigators find in the notes the sketch of a device that uses modern amplification to mimic the bell's harmonics, and an address scribbled in margins. It is evidence of replication attempts. It is evidence of intent. The village's oldest elder curses softly when she sees the drawings and then speaks a precaution in the old language that the translator will not render for the record. What she utters feels like a sealing. An allied linguist identifies a word in the elder's curse that, in the old tongue, translates roughly as binding of mouths, a legal metaphor and a ritual one. The community's response is to perform a binding of its own, a night-long watch where the elders walk the shoreline and mark the places where the bell's throat would be exposed to moon. They carry cedar and salt and speak names into the wind. The ritual feels both archaic and necessary. Meanwhile, a shadow moves within bureaucracy. A government official, the kind who measures heritage primarily as a fiscal asset, calls the museum and asks pointed questions about the Codex's marketability. He hints, almost politely, at possibilities of partnership with private firms. The researchers sense a pressure that is not scientific but economic. A funder, anonymous and large, offers to underwrite conservation in exchange for data rights. The museum director coughs politely into his hand and says nothing immediately. His silence says more than any contract could. Power accumulates where money and secrecy meet. If the callers wish to weaponize sound, then the investors wish to monetize it. Both impulses converge on the same vulnerable point, the Codex. Not all callers are malign. A small group of artisans, descendants of coastal craftsmen, shows up with tools and oral fragments. They bring salt-stiff songs and an old way of lacing reed instruments. When they hum beside the spiral bell, the space answers with a tone that seems to recognize their breath. The resonance is warm and familiar, it resembles memory. For a night the team watches tears roll down cheeks that had hardened with skepticism. Those tears are not merely emotional. They are evidence of relational knowledge that did not survive on paper alone. Relational knowledge complicates legal claims. If an artifact functions only when certain people perform it, who owns it? The state? The community? The global commons? The question has no tidy answers. Courts are slow and often insufficiently imaginative. Ethicists draft guidelines that sound prudent but wind up as footnotes in committee minutes. Meanwhile, the tides continue their patient erasures. As the debate rages, another theft occurs, this time subtler. A page from the Codex disappears overnight from a secured display. The glass is not broken. The page is gone as if never there. Panic ripples through the team. The loss is not merely of paper. It is of the sequence that connected a recipe to its ritual steps. A gap opens in the ledger. The community gathers and performs a ritual of lament, weaving chords and speaking names aloud so that the missing letter will not be lost entirely. They tie the cords to a post at the harbor, each knot is a promise to remember. Who took the page? Sponsored collectors? The caller seeking an edge? Or an insider who believed the knowledge should be free? Theories proliferate like gulls. Each accuses a different kind of hunger. Investigations reveal a mark on the display case, a nearly invisible abrasion consistent with a thin implement and a practiced hand. Forensic note, 2023. The team narrows suspects and tempers. Trust, once again, re-enters the ledger as currency more volatile than gold. That evening, Tomas returns to the chamber with a different air. He brings with him a small child who will not speak, a child whose fingers trace the concentric mark without fear. Tomas says only that the child's mother heard the bell call and followed a route none could see. The child's presence suggests continuity. It also suggests vulnerability, someone who has been exposed to the bell's practice without protection. At the shore, the caller's boats now sit like dark teeth, and the investigators find a crude transmitter hidden in one of them. It is jury-rigged but functional, capable of producing a harmonic cluster not unlike the bell's note. The transmitter's parts are modern: copper coils, a battery pack, a speaker grill. Its existence confirms fear. Replication is possible with contemporary tools. The team confiscates the device and adds it to a sealed crate labeled with a thin red ribbon. The red ribbon will not stop other hands. Knowledge once let loose is difficult to recapture. Secrecy curdles into rumor, and rumor into marketable myth. The community knows this better than the scientists. As night falls and the tide draws back, Tomas stands again at the plaque and recites a fragment of a litany that no book contains. It sounds like counting and like comfort. The team records it with permission. The sound is small and human, and in the quiet that follows, everyone listens to the place where the bells should be and wonders whether they will ever be able to keep the past intact in a world that makes commerce of wonder. Who, then, will guard how we remember? Who will decide which rituals are saved and which are sold? The answer, for now, rest in a small harbor where cedar smoke curls into the sky and a group of people tie cords to a post and vow to watch. Salt fog turns the harbor lights into soft haloed moons. Ropes groan like old throats. A gull lands on a bollard and shakes its wings, flinging an arc of water that glitters like thrown silver. The night tastes of metal and cedar smoke. Maps unspool across tables, a fisherman's sketch, a surveyor's grid, a child's crude drawing that places the Recluse mark under a chapel roof. When these maps are overlaid, faint corridors begin to appear, a lattice linking tower to inlet to island, and the Codex's inscription seems less a singular act than a waypoint in a larger system. Survey Overlay, 2022. The revelation reframes every theory, not siloed practice, but networked craft. How large was the network? A few coves and one island, or an arc of harbors stretching farther than any ledger recorded? The team sails at dawn to an island 30 minutes beyond the shoals where old logs speak of a chapel and a bell that never tolls. Low cliffs make hungry shapes against the sea. Lichen stains the rock like old script. They climb and find a stone foundation half buried, mortar starved to powder. In the earth, a line of post holes marks a structure whose plan echoes the Codex's interior niche drawings, a central pit, peripheral alcoves, the same choreography of space repeated across geography. Replication across sites suggests intentional diffusion, a network not by accident, but by design. A weathered fisherman on the island points to a ledge and mouths a phrase the translator renders as, "The map remembers." He draws a finger across the ledge in a slow line as if tracing the route the community once took with their rituals. The islander's memory is patchwork, names that survive and lullabies, a tool-making song hummed at ferry crossings, a gesture used when launching boats. These fragments are not proofs, but they are not nothing either. They are the sinew that binds practice to place. Ethnographic Interview, 2022. There is a practical architecture to the network. Stones dressed to fit, channels carved to move small boats at certain tides, caches set into cliff faces and sealed with wedges that match the canister's alloy composition. These features argue for logistic intent, not just ritual, but movement, of people, of objects, of information. If knowledge needed protection, dispersal across multiple sites would be the natural insurance policy. If power needed projection, a network would be the means. At low tide, the team exposes a shallow trench where a line of stones leads to a sinkhole. Inside the hole lies a cache, a small wooden box sealed with resin, and inside the box, a folded band of copper etched with sigils that mirror the Codex's marginal marks. The copper's patina is marine green, soft to the touch. When polished, an incised tally becomes visible, small notches like counting teeth. Someone once used this band as a ledger of actions. Who counted? Who tallied favors, rights, or debts? Networks require governance, rules that travel as reliably as the rope across the bow. The Codex's lists, when viewed with the ledger markings on the copper band, suggest a protocol. Nodes reported status at fixed lunar intervals. Certain minor rituals were reserved for local keepers. Major rites required a quorum of named individuals. The material record mirrors social organization. Governance is not incidental, it is part of the technology. But networks invite exploitation. A copied ritual, performed without the network's ethics, might be used to coerce or to claim legitimacy. The caller's efforts to mimic the bell, now supplemented by modern amplification, threaten precisely that erosion, the conversion of communal testimony into private leverage. If a sound can be faked, what then counts as witness? In a dusty ledger found under a stone hearth, the team locates a list of fines for ringing the bell without quorum, fines for revealing a route, fines for selling ritual objects. The penalties are precise and feel surprisingly modern: archival fragment, rusted ink, 18th century hand. This is governance writ small and enforceable. It is evidence that the network policed itself. Perhaps that policing is what kept the technologies from being commodified until modernity's hunger arrived. A songbook, its binding long gone, yields half phrases when held to the light. Notation marks suggest a cadence matching experiments in the spiral bell, rhythmic breaths timed to tidal click points. The music is functional as well as beautiful, a mnemonic device, a living ledger encoded in melody so that those who could sing would remember the sequence. Oral memory was the network's backup drive. If paper fails, the song persists. If the song is banned, the network frays. One morning, an old woman brings a small woven pouch to the team lead and asks that it be placed where the bell's tone would rest. Inside, a single bead of baked clay marked with a tiny dot. She says, without preface, "For the keeper." Her gaze is steady. The bead's simplicity belies its meaning. Material tokens circulated within the network to authorize presence. Possession signaled trust. Without token, a voice had no standing. Material tokens, rules, songs, all this careful scaffolding speaks against the idea that the Codex was merely an eccentric artisan's notebook. It was an apparatus of social technology, an infrastructure as much as it was an artifact. Understanding it requires not just archaeology, but anthropology, law, acoustics, and a willingness to sit with uncertainty. Which begs the question, what broke the network? Did plague thin ranks? Did conquest reorder priorities? Did internal betrayal erode trust until secrecy collapsed into silence? The archaeologists find a concentration of charred layers in one site, a tinderbox of ash that suggests a conflagration. Charred bone fragments mingle with melted metal droplets. The pattern implies violent disturbance rather than ritual cleansing. Excavation Report, 2023. Fire is a blunt instrument. It does not discriminate between artifact and archive. When the team dates the charred layer, results cluster around a year of known regional unrest, radiocarbon range, mid-17th century. The timeline fits a model of disruption. Disruption forces adaptation. If the network was damaged, survivors may have hidden remnant knowledge, converting technical protocols into parables and songs, code and stories. The Codex, then, becomes a relic of a more open architecture. Its survival may be due to fortunate concealment rather than deliberate continuity. But concealment carries cost, loss of context. The very acts that save an object can also make it unreadable. At dusk, a radio crackles with a voice that seems not entirely human, a transmission picked up between channels, a rhythm like a bell scoring a heartbeat. The team hushes. One engineer checks equipment for interference, another whispers of atmospheric effects. No source is located. The moment feels uncanny, as if the landscape itself remembers the network and is trying to speak in the old cadence. Superstition rises among the crew like tide. Tools are touched less, words measured. Superstition has practical consequences. Anxieties around the bell and its replicas shape decisions about access and disclosure. The research board institutes a new protocol. Any acoustic experiment must have community consent and a holding plan in case of desirable but dangerous effects. Ethics are no longer abstract. They are operational constraints that slow the march of inquiry. Slowing can be frustrating, yet haste can be ruinous. Late nights yield a different treasure, a set of personal letters folded and stitched into a ragged cloth, intimate notes between two keepers arguing about whether to sell a device to a passing foreign captain in exchange for grain. Their handwriting trembles with hunger and stubbornness. One signs, "Keep the bell for the children." This small human moment cuts through the technicalities. The network was built by people with needs, fears, and moral choices. Human motives complicate pure theories. They remind researchers that artifacts are the epilogues of human stories, not their authors. When the team returns to the chamber with new hypotheses, governance, token economies, mimetic songs, the spiral bell seems less like an isolated miracle and more like the keystone of a social contract. The device's function depended on trust, on tokens, on songs to encode procedure. This reframing changes the ethical calculus. Protecting the bell means protecting the people and practices that render it meaningful. If you had to choose, what would you preserve, the object, the ritual, or the community? There is no neat answer. Each choice sacrifices something else. As the chapter winds, the investigators gather in a small room above the harbor and chart scenarios for future stewardship. Papers, sticky notes, and coffee cups mark the meeting. The conversation hums between idealism and practical constraint. One proposal stands out, a distributed archive, where digital renderings and local custodianship coexist, a compromise, imperfect yet promising. It is not a full solution. But networks, after all, are built by iterative agreements. Outside, the harbor breathes with tides and gulls. On the pier, a child runs fingers along a rope and hums a tune that shapes, like water, around the old marks. Somewhere beneath the waves, the memory of structured community waits, patient as stone. Perhaps the network never died. Perhaps it sleeps, waking only when someone remembers the right song, holds the right bead, and speaks the name the sea knows. They call that name, quietly, in the dark. A frost of salt crystals rims the window each morning like a tiny map of weather. Coffee steams on the makeshift table. In the steam, diagrams rearrange themselves into possible sequences. Outside, gulls argue over a tossed fish head as if litigating the sea's ownership. The lab smells of solvent and old paper, a scent that makes the team move more slowly as if reverence is a methodological requirement. Conservators lay pages on blotting paper under calibrated lamps, their gloved fingers a choreography learned over years. Each touch is recorded in a log that reads like an inventory and a prayer. When a conservator leans close enough for breath to fog the glass, she reads a marginal note aloud and the room holds its breath. Keep the turning clean. The phrase could be mechanical advice or moral counsel. In this project, such ambiguities are the rule rather than the exception. Conservation Report, 2024. A cold case paleographer arrives with a reputation for patience and a laugh that breaks tension. He spreads photographs of the Codex under a magnifier, tracing the ink's flow like a detective reading handwriting. He identifies a tiny flourish repeated at the end of several lines, a personal mark, perhaps the scribe's signature folded into a habit. If that mark can be linked to other manuscripts, the Codex's origin narrows. If not, the flourish becomes an index of isolation. He smiles and says, "Sometimes the smallest habit is the loudest witness." We listen because the small habits, once found, can be the hinge on which entire chronologies turn. Outside the lab, the village holds its own meetings at the community hall where the air smells of boiled tea and wet wool. Elders sit in a circle and pass a wooden cup as if passing testimony. They discuss stewardship not as abstract policy but as obligation. Who will teach the songs? Who will guard the tokens? Who will watch the harbor during thin nights? Their deliberations are practical. Rotating watches, signal codes known only to families, and a ledger kept in the old tongue that lists those who have been entrusted across generations. The community's memory is both archive and law. It resists being reduced to paper alone. On another table lies a small satchel of instruments returned by the thief months earlier. Forensics examined them and found work traces, filings, dents, a smudge of pitch. A metalworker in the team recognizes a temper line that speaks of a specific local smithing technique once taught by apprenticeship rather than by book. Material traces carry the invisible grammar of skill, how a hand steadies a file, how elbow pressure shapes a lip. These traces intimate that knowledge traveled person to person long before it was ever inked. A visiting acoustic scientist proposes a radical experiment, to build a digital twin of the spiral bell inside an anechoic chamber, and then subject it to controlled breath patterns algorithmically derived from the Codex's notations. The proposal reads like the future touching the past. Some team members recoil at the mechanization of ritual. Others argue that simulation offers a path to understanding without exposing the original to harm. Acoustic Modeling, Preliminary, 2024. The debate is not merely technical, it is philosophical. Can replication outside of human ritual reveal the same truth, or only a pale shadow? At night, the conservator dreams of margins curling like waves. She wakes and finds that a single page has an ink smear previously unnoticed. The smear forms a faint, concentric pattern around a small phrase. It is the kind of detail that scholars love and dread because new details change probability maps. A single smear can make an old hypothesis more plausible and another less so. They call it the whirl, and argue about whether it was accidental, a blot from a rushed hand, or intentional, a deliberate mark to draw attention to a sequence. The argument becomes a study in human intentionality. Someone in the team uncovers a ledger in a distant archive, a list of payments to a keeper of tones. paid in grain and salt for services rendered to ships. The ledger dates to a century after the Codex's probable sealing, archival find, merchant book, 18th century, and yet the title resonates. The same role appears in the Codex's lists under a different name but similar duties. Continuity across centuries suggests either cultural persistence or an institutional legacy that adapted and persisted. If roles travel across time, so might responsibilities and taboos. If taboos persist, they guard the device's use like a legal membrane. A grad student obsessed with patterns runs a statistical analysis on the marginal numbers and claims a correlation with lunar phases and a little-known tidal phenomenon in the region. The room brightens with possibility. The grad student's excitement is contagious because correlations, when verified, can convert rumor into infrastructure. But caution tempers celebration. Correlation is not causation, and the grad student's dataset is small and noisy. Yet the implication is powerful. Knowledge encoded as ritual counts could have been an elegant and covert method of sharing hydrological intelligence. In the middle of the night, a call comes from the island. A shallow tremor, fishermen report windows rattled though no quake was recorded elsewhere. They say the bells sang under the sea, a low, mournful tone that carried for meters. The team radios the divers. Underwater sensors pick up a faint burst consistent with low-frequency resonance at the chamber's mouth. Acoustic anomaly log, night measurement, 2024. Could the device, even idle, respond to large-scale environmental stimuli? The prospect is both thrilling and alarming, a technology that interacts with landscape as well as with humans. Ethicists write memos with heavy pens. One memo cautions against provocative experiments that might trigger resonances with unforeseen ecological effects. Another memo, more conciliatory, suggests staged simulations that model ecological coupling with strict oversight. The duality is emblematic. Curiosity stretches into responsibility in ways that cannot be disentangled. At dawn, a figure appears at the lab door, a woman whose hands are callous from netting, whose eyes hold storm-time knowledge. She brings with her a small palm-sized book in a modern hand. She had learned to read from a missionary decades ago, and had copied a page from memory when the Codex left the village. Her hand trembles as she lays the copied page on the table. The transcription is imperfect, the strokes softened by memory, but the presence of a living mnemonic alters the probability calculus. Oral copying, imperfect though it is, preserves performative cues that no imaging can capture. The team now holds 3 strands of evidence: the material codex, digital reconstructions, and living memory. Each offers different epistemic value. The conservator cautions that overprivileging digital twins risks something important: the seduction of seeing a model as the thing itself. The archivist adds that living memory may be fragmentary, but it bears gestures and inflections that are absent from notation. The debate becomes, again, about what constitutes sufficient evidence to enact or restrict performance. One late afternoon, a burst of letters arrives, petitions from international researchers requesting data, a letter from a private foundation offering funds with strings, and most chillingly, an anonymous communication containing a photograph of the stolen page now in an unknown hand, annotated in a crude contemporary script and offered for sale. The presence of the stolen page in circulation proves what many feared: commodification is underway. The team feels a compression. Either they open the Codex to controlled, transparent study to undercut black market demand, or they tighten custody and risk losing broader scholarly collaboration. Each choice accelerates politics. A quiet consensus forms around a hybrid strategy: share high resolution, but truncated, digital models with vetted scholars while creating a controlled in situ program for ritual performance that privileges community custodianship. The hybrid scaffolds both preservation and access and attempts to distribute authority rather than centralize it. It is a compromise that pleases no one completely and satisfies some pragmatically. Implementation will be hard. Human systems resist design. In the days that follow, the lab becomes a place of converging rituals, software updates, tea-making, the careful turning of pages, and the elders' nightly recitations. One evening, an elder sings a song whose rhythm matches the grad student's statistical sequence. The students stop and look at one another, struck by how melody can compress algorithmic detail into embodied form. This moment is an epiphany. Knowledge is multilayered, written, sung, built, and each layer protects and adapts the others. Not all revelations are gentle. A leaked recording surfaces on a fringe forum, a distorted clip of a simulated bell tone, described breathlessly as the real thing, though it lacks the subtle harmonics the team has documented. The forum's comments spiral into commercialization fantasies and conspiracy mashups. The leak forces the museum to tighten press protocols and the community to instruct youth about the dangers of naive sharing. The modern world's appetite for spectacle threatens to make the Codex an object of commerce rather than care. When a delegation from a cultural heritage NGO arrives, they bring expertise in stewardship models that privilege community governance and legal frameworks for intangible cultural heritage. Their proposals map pathways for protecting songs, rituals, and tokens under a blended legal design that resists simple privatization. The village elders respond with guarded optimism. Legal instruments can protect, but only if they are responsive to local ethics. The interplay of law and custom is delicate work. At the edges of these negotiations, the callers befriend a local youth who knows the back lanes and has a talent for electronics. They teach him to build transmitters. He shows them places to hide. Motives are messy: hunger, curiosity, the desire to be someone in a world that values novelty. When the team discovers the trainees' involvement, they face the human cost of exclusion. Policing knowledge without addressing need fosters collusion. It becomes painfully clear that ethical stewardship must account for livelihoods, not only for conservation. The grad student presents a paper at a modest conference, careful to anonymize sensitive details. He argues that the Codex illustrates a hybrid knowledge system where material craft, song, and ritual governance cohere into a durable infrastructure. His slides show spectrograms, marginalia close-ups, and a map of network sites. The response is enthusiastic and skeptical in equal measure. In the hallway after his talk, a curator asks if they might digitize their holdings under similar protocols. The idea gains traction. The Codex becomes an emblem for a new approach to heritage, one that treats performance and object as co-equal. Even as models and memos accumulate, the sea keeps its own time. In one of the quieter hours before dawn, a keeper walks the shore and finds a child asleep beside a coil of rope, a clay bead clutched in a small fist. The keeper wakes the child gently and ties a cord around his wrist, then whispers an old counting rhyme. It is a small, unrecorded act of transmission that no model can capture, and yet it may be the most important, the passing of practice from palm to palm. What then is the Codex? An instruction set, a hymn book, a charter, a ledger, a weapon, a lullaby? It is all of these and none fully. It is a knot of practices wrapped in metal, ink, and memory. The team learns that answers will always be provisional and that the ethic of stewardship requires humility. Humility, after all, acknowledges that some knowledge resists ownership. And when the sea sends another low, faint bell under the waves, the village watches rather than acts, listening, as if listening itself were a form of care. They decided on a night of decisions. The harbor gathered like an audience, lanterns bobbing, voices low as tide. A rope line marked a sacred perimeter. Elders held tokens, scientists held records, children held nothing and everything. No one knows exactly who suggested the compromise, whether it was the museum director, the village matriarch, or the small child who slept with a clay bead in his fist. But the idea took shape with the slow logic of the sea. Disperse knowledge so that no single hand can sell it, encode the practice in many small forms, and bind access to living protocols. It was not a perfect solution. It was an honest one. Short ritual instructions were read aloud in the old tongue and in the new one. The same words felt different depending on who spoke them. They were careful to speak nothing technical in public. Technicality was a vulnerable thing. Instead, they spoke of keeping, of tending, of listening like a neighbor listens to a cough. The elders nodded as if approving a pact between weather and habit. They performed a sealing not of hiding but of scattering. Copies of certain diagrams were etched on many small objects, beads, tiles, lengths of rope measured and knotted, distributed not for sale but as responsibility. Each token carried a fragment, a breath count, a notch in the knot, a single harmonic interval. The tokens were simple and portable. They were worthless to a market that wanted spectacle but meaningful to a network that valued memory. Whoever held a token was entrusted with a task: recite a line, guard a song, watch a shore. The Codex itself was handled last. Conservators prepared the case, buffers of wool, desiccants like small sentries. A glass dome would cradle the canister and pages. The dome would be ventilated only in the presence of a quorum designated by the community. It would not be locked away, in the sense of denied. Rather, it would be shared in a pattern that respected the rhythms that birthed it. Access would require rights and records would circulate in the network as much as objects did. When the canister's lid opened that night, breath was held across generations. No showy demonstration, no investor cameras, no eager opportunist at the edge. Just the slow, ceremonious turning of a key, the careful light across linen, and the pages, pale as undersea bone, revealed for a respectful instant. An elder read one line aloud, a line that had nothing to do with mechanism and everything to do with charge. "We hold so the children will know how to care." The phrase landed like an anchor. A child who had been observant and quiet, the same who once traced concentric marks in the sand, was handed the smallest token, a bead with a single notch. He did not look older when he took it, but the room felt different. The responsibility lay like salt on his tongue. Tomas, whose hands had trembled with stories, pressed the child's fingers around the bead and said softly, "Remember the counting." The child nodded, a small, certain motion, like a keel finding its balance. They agreed to a living archive, a set of dispersed nodes where tokens, songs, and restricted artifacts would be kept within households and community spaces rather than ghosted in distant vaults. Digital surrogates, high-resolution models and annotated spectrograms, would be shared with vetted scholars under terms that forbade commercial exploitation and required community consultation. The museum would host a steward who answered to both its board and the village council. The legalese that wrapped the agreement was long and imperfect, but it sat under the shared memory like netting under a dock, protective, necessary, not entirely beautiful. No one knows whether the protocol would survive the slow corrosions of time and temptation. Custodianship is not a single event, it is a habit repeated by hands that sometimes forget. In the months that followed, the tension thinned into practice. Workshops taught youth how to make the humble tokens and sang the mnemonic chants until the rhythms fit into living pulses again. Conservators rotated displays so that the Codex's pages rested between viewings. The transistorized transmitter seized from the collars was melted down and reforged into simple cleats for fishing boats, turned from a replicator of uncanny sound into something that tied a net. Transformation like this carried symbolic weight, objects reborn as useful things rather than prized curiosities. The callers, when tracked, were many things: opportunists, amateurs, earnest seekers who did not understand what they had touched. Some were prosecuted by law for theft, some were offered inclusion and instruction, some drifted away with their notions half-formed. A few callers returned to the network offering skills, electronics taught under conditions of mutual accountability, and their reintegration strained old resentments, but also widened the base of stewardship. The community found its hands fuller, its obligations heavier, and its possibilities more resilient when former antagonists worked at mending rather than taking. At the center of the story, the Codex persisted as a miracle and a problem. Scientists continued to study its inks and alas under watchful eyes. Conservators kept the pages breathing under controlled atmospheres. Ethnographers documented song lines into living archives that would remain under community control. Papers were published, but the most telling knowledge remained embodied. The way to count breaths, the way to knot a rope, the way to stand at a given notch and listen. In one quiet passage of the Codex, a sentence that had seemed functional revealed itself also as a moral ledger. "Bind the mouths that sell the breath." The phrasing shocked modern readers until a linguist suggested a softer translation. "Bury the practice of sale." The difference is subtle but telling. The people who wrote the Codex were not so much forbidding trade as they were protecting the integrity of care. Their taboo was not against exchange itself but against the commodification that dismembers community. When a winter storm ripped the coast and tossed great driftwood like sacrificial planks onto the shore, the community rehearsed its rites and tended one another. The tokens were used that season as signals. A notch means the elder needs coal, a bead means bring bread. The practical uses of symbolic objects knit together living survival and ritual meaning. In crisis, the Codex's dispersed ethics proved as useful as its technical notes. Technology and care, intimacy and craft, braided together. A few secrets never yielded. Certain marginal notations resisted clear reading. The cipher remained only partially cracked. Some instruments had no obvious modern analogues. The third category of callers, that Tomas had named, those that were not men, or more accurately, liminal actors who moved between craft and commerce and who wore personas like garments, remained a political mystery more than a technical one. The sea held these absences like hidden shoals. They prevented complacency. If the story closed any thread, it closed only to open others. The network had survived by becoming less a closed system and more a practice distributed across people and objects, by turning potential spectacle into daily care, by translating harmful curiosity into communal obligation. The Codex ceased to be merely an enigma in a museum case. It became a reason for neighbors to teach neighbors and for institutions to learn how to consult rather than command. In the last winter before the conservators rotated abroad, the child with the bead, now a young keeper in modest ways, led a small circle in the tower's ruin. He could not read the whole Codex, but he knew the counting, the first 2 breaths, the first stanza of the song that taught when to oil a mechanism and when to comfort a bereaved family. He placed his bead into a small wooden bowl and said the coin of duty aloud. For those who keep, unmake the hunger to sell. His words were simple, their ethics stubbornly human. As the coastal community adapted, the academic world learned to be smaller in its claims and larger in its humility. Papers cited practices as knowledge, not curiosities. Grants required community consent before funds flowed. The Codex became a case study in how heritage might be stewarded, not as treasure extracted, but as practice sustained. That lesson traveled further than any bell. If you stood at the water's edge that final evening, when lanterns mirrored stars and the tide breathed slow, you would see the circle of people and the single small bead cupped in a child's palm. You would hear a song that did not try to reconstruct the past perfectly but honored it carefully. You might feel a final tone, soft as a held breath, that was not the bell ringing for spectacle but a community marking its own persistence. The narrative closes not on revelation but on the practice of guarding, small acts repeated until they become a habit strong enough to resist market pressure. The Codex remained mysterious in many respects. It refused to be fully owned by any one perspective. That refusal was perhaps its final gift, a reminder that wonder is not always to be consumed, and that some kinds of knowledge preserve themselves best when shared as responsibility rather than as data. A coda, months later, a conservator opened a private letter written by an elderly keeper who had been present at the sealing. She wrote, in small careful script, "We held the pages, and they taught us to be slow." The sentence reads like a benediction and a method. No one knows what the sea will return next. No one knows whether another device, another codex, another small set of practices waits in the currents, patient and deliberate. And perhaps that is the point, to leave some answers to time, and to allow communities the dignity of deciding what to reveal. The final 3 lines fell from the elder that night like small candles. We do not own the tide, we learn to listen. We do not sell the bell, we teach its counting. We do not perfect the past, we care for its echoes.